What do you think about what the economics profession can actually do to introduce new moral foundations in the financial market?
Yeah, the point that you raise is a very important one, and the point, you know, and it also emphasizes that Adam Smith was much more critical of the market economy than people who are believe in Adam Smith. He also talked very much about the roles of monopolies. That there's a famous quotation that businessmen never get together without conspiring to act against the public interest. So there's a lot of differing strands, but one of the very important strands is the one that you stressed on moral behavior. One of the implications of this more simplistic view of Adam Smith, the one that I gave in the beginning, which is individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest lead to the well-being of society, is that there is no role for ethics. If that theorem were true, if Adam Smith's theorem, that invisible hand theorem were true, what it would say is the only unethical behavior would be not being sufficiently self-interested. And in that sense, you would say the bankers were extraordinarily ethical. But what modern economics has been trying to do, in some sense, is to say, well, what was wrong with that statement, that pursuit of self-interest leads to your own, to societal well-being? And part of that has to do with the issue of the issue of externalities that I stressed. There's another part, though, that I haven't had time to talk about, but that's also important, that, again, in the simplistic interpretations of economics that we leave out, which is whether people honor their contracts. It's another aspect of, you might say, ethical behavior. Now, in standard economics, where there is perfect information, honoring contracts is never an issue. You say, I'm going to do something. If you do it, you get paid. If you don't do it, you don't get paid. So enforcement of contracts is simply not an issue. In the real world, enforcement of contracts is very important. And the way they are enforced implicitly in many societies is people have honor, have ethics, that if they said they're going to do something, they actually do it. Economists have modeled this in a little bit more formal way of implicit, of reputation, repeated games, where we've taken out the moral aspect, but said that people have incentives to behave in certain ways that are, you might call, more ethical. So I think that one can try to incorporate an understanding of some of these ethical concepts, like honesty, doing what you say, deception, in terms of these economic models, but they are totally left out of models in which there's perfect information, in which there are no externalities. And that's why, another reason why those models are so misleading in terms of insights into how economies need to function.
Okay, down here.
Can I just ask you a quick question? In terms of these global classes,
Can everyone hear? No. Can you just wait 1 second? Mic is coming.
I personally think having a global system is a very big problem myself. That having a global regulation system could be a huge problem in the fact that there is no such thing as perfect information, and the fact that human mistake is very much normal. It seems to me a much better idea people have individual systems so that if there is a flaw in that system, it doesn't have the systemic risk. So, for example, the US system isn't so fantastic. If we took it all on, Australia would be in a lot worse position than we are right now.
Yeah. Well, let me say, there are two aspects of that question I want to pick up on. One of them is that we've become much more sensitive to the realization that diversity has value. That one of the problems that caused the crisis was that too many people were doing things that were too similar. And since they were all using the same flawed models, that when the price of housing went down, they all got caught up, and that exacerbated the downturn. So that diversity is actually very important for the functioning of the economy, for the stability of the economy, and therefore you want to maintain that some kinds of diversity. And excessive regulatory uniformity would undermine that diversity and could, in that sense, lead to a more unstable system. So that is a very important insight that people are beginning to finally come to terms with. But when you have a global regulatory system, it's not saying that everybody has to do exactly the same thing, but what it is saying is that we have to protect ourselves in one way or another against, those countries that have fully opened up their markets financially have to be in some ways aware that there may be financial products and financial coming from abroad and financial relations with other less well-regulated entities, and they have to take that into account. So that, for instance, the prototypical example of this is Iceland. Iceland was a small economy, 300,000 people, and had a financial sector that was 12 times its GDP. And was very successful in what it did is it went to the UK and offered higher interest rates to UK depositors. And they were foolish enough to believe that Iceland regulation was good and that there was a free lunch. You could get higher returns without risk. So in the model that was being set up, which is a single market, that firms that we will allow banks regulated in any entity of the world to operate anywhere else in the world, that was a natural thing for them for people to accept. Okay, but the problem is that system can't work anymore because we now know that it is too risky, and that if we allow any rogue state, any small country to have an unregulated banking system, it will engage in deceiving. There will be risk of that kind of deception happening again. So you have to deal with that problem in one way or another. Now, one way of dealing with it is to say we won't allow any other country's banks to operate. That's to close off your boundaries. And, but nobody wants to go to that extreme. The other one is a very costly one, is that we will regulate the product of any product coming into our country as if it were produced here, but that's very costly to do all that regulation. And so the hope is that we can create at least enough agreement about what good regulation is that we can protect our citizens and our economy from external risks. Have some degree of openness, but also some degree of protection. And that's really where the current debate is. How do we get the degree of protection that Australia has good regulation, but you could, if you hadn't had regulation that stopped an Icelandic bank opening up, maybe Australians would have deposited money and would have had the same problem that the UK does. So you need some degree of harmonization if you're not going to have a closing down of global financial markets.
I know we've got many questions, but we are out of time. I hope that we can continue the discussion over drinks. I'd like to thank Professor Stiglitz on behalf of the university and the faculty.